It's no secret that America's most industrious cities have developed along the banks of its great waterways. These slow-moving but powerful arteries have carried goods, services, and culture that fueled a growing nation. We all know that progress comes with a cost, but only now are we starting to realize the price of the legacy that our ancestors left behind. At the dawn of the last century, our growing nation was starving for resources. There was little consideration for the future of the environment. And now, generations later, we are left to deal with their lack of insight. One part of that story starts along the banks of a river in West Virginia, just outside of Morgantown. Nobody really knows how the river got its name, but as far back as anyone can remember, before the United States was a nation, and long before the region was part of what is now called West Virginia, it has been called the Cheat River. Ralph McCarty shares his version of this local folklore.
There was a French Huguenot named Jacques that trapped up this way from North Carolina. These cartographers who came through, the map makers in the early days, if you lived on a particular run, they would ask you your name, and that turned out to be the name of the run. This happened to be Jacques' Chateau. In spelling it out on his map, it got abridged and emasculated down to Cheat.
The early European settlers gained access to the area by traveling the Indian trails that followed the great rivers and streams of the watershed. It was easier to follow the river valleys than to blaze new trails over the mountains. Early explorers had already navigated most of the eastern waterways, but the rivers of the Central Appalachians refused for many years to cooperate. The New, the Gauley, the Tigard, and the Cheat were untamable river highways, and often described by the local Native American tribes as rivers of death.
Now, the Cheat is not considered a navigable river. From its source in Randolph County to its mouth in Point Marion, Pennsylvania, it falls over 3,000 feet.
In spite of wild rivers and harsh terrain, some of the first settlers made their homes throughout the watershed.
As time passed, more people came into this valley, settled along the creek.
As early pioneers, they found abundant game, clean water, fish, and large tracts of timber. These thick blankets of forest would spawn the first major industry in the area, logging.
Much of the wood was used in the manufacture of charcoal for iron making, and then some of it was rafted down the Cheat River.
Every log cut out of those counties was floated down the Cheat through what's now the famous whitewatering country, through what's now Cheat Lake, and down to Point Marion, where there were big sawmills that caught these logs in big booms.
The first environmental effects of this great demand for lumber would be felt far from the watershed itself. Excessive stripping of timber in West Virginia's highlands caused severe flooding in the city of Pittsburgh, over 100 miles away. For the first time in the watershed, it was apparent that environmental impacts of any industry had to be taken seriously.
So the Cheat, actually, when they started Eastern National Forest, was the first stream to start to be protected.
The preservation of the Monongahela National Forest was a monumental step for conservationists, but the timber industry wasn't the only threat that the environment has had to face.
Starting about 1796, they discovered that there was iron in the Cheat Mountain Range. Iron was a very scarce product. Most of the people coming in, the only iron they had was an axe, a rifle, and a pocket full of nails.
Relics of 18th century iron furnaces are still visible along the banks of the Cheat River and its tributaries.
By the 1830s, there were 4 or 5 iron furnaces right there in that Cheat Mountain area. And this was a period when iron making and logging were the prominent industries.
It was the demand for these resources, fueled by the onslaught of the Civil War, that sparked the great railroad building era, and Appalachia's rivers provided a pre-cut pass through the mountains.
This period started with the construction of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which passed through the watershed in 1852. The Baltimore How was quite an engineering feat. In fact, two of the most famous engineering monuments of the B&O still stand in Preston County. The Trays Run Viaduct, which is essentially a bridge over a large valley, and then nearby is the Kingwood Tunnel, which when it was built in 1852 was the largest in the world.
Speculators now had a way to get the massive amounts of coal and timber out of the mountains. The boom was on. For the first time, coal consumption in the U.S. surpassed wood consumption, and by the late 1880s, large-scale mining and logging were welcomed as the economic salvation of this difficult, sparsely settled land, once again ignoring environmental consequences as the frenzy raged on.
Along with timber came the great coal rush of the 1890 to 1920 period. Hundreds of mines were started, not just in the Cheat Watershed, but all over West Virginia.
The nation's furnaces and its locomotives were fueled with this coal. Later, Appalachian coal fueled America's Industrial Revolution. In 1900, West Virginia mines produced 21 million tons of coal and employed 28,000 people. By World War I, the mountains had been penetrated by railroads, and the region's vast coal reserves could be reached and marketed at last.
The coal mining industry came into that area. There were some mines that developed during the First World War, but the big onslaught was strip mining that came in during the Second World War. The big energy source during World War II was coal.
Production rose steadily and peaked in 1947 when 173 million tons were mined and approximately 120,000 people were employed. Rivers delivered coal and coke that smelted the iron into steel. The rivers were the lifeblood of the emerging nation. America's streams were her roads, yet they were also her sewers. Every time the earth was pierced, layers of rock high in pyrite began to oxidize, forming what we now call acid mine drainage. Dr. Paul Zimkevich of the National Research Center for Coal and Energy.
Acid mine drainage is the kind of acid water that you get out of a mining environment where the rocks or the coal contain pyrite, and the pyrite then comes in contact with air and water. The overall chemical reaction gives you sulfuric acid and dissolved metals like iron, manganese, and aluminum.
Either unaware or indifferent to any potential environmental disaster, the mining continued virtually unregulated.
A lot of this resulted in runoff, acid runoff, because the coal had an overburden of iron pyrites. And this started to degrade the river and reduce the fishing population.
Studies have shown that the fish populations are reduced up to 90% throughout much of the river because of the acid mine drainage.
I've heard tales of people having walleyed pike and bass in Cheat River, and this goes way back in the 20s and 30s, but I understand it was just a wonderful fishery.
The upper part of the river, the northern part, is the whitewater stretch. It's also some of the better fish habitat. Unfortunately, it's also the stretch where most of the acid mine drainage impacts the river.
There's been some studies done by the cold water fisheries, and it was based on some information, I think, from the Fish and Wildlife Service that showed that a mile of trout stream is worth over $40,000 to the economy. The economic benefits are much greater than people think. If you have fish in the river, you've got a good river.
Fishing wasn't the only industry to suffer from the effects of acid mine drainage. During the late 60s and early 70s, whitewater kayaking started to become a popular sport.
I started hiking along the Cheat in 1953, and it was 1970 and 71 before I ever saw a kayak or a raft going through the narrows or going through the canyon.
Throughout the 70s and early 80s, many people were introduced to the wonders of classic whitewater on the Cheat.
We were the first to run the Cheat River as a commercial enterprise. So we bought a raft from the Pittsburgh AYH that we called the Black Maria, and it was an old military raft, and it had more patches on it than anything else. And it turns out that more people wanted to go in the raft than wanted to go in the kayak, so well, my mama didn't raise no dummies, and that it came on pretty fast that maybe there's something to this rafting business.
Many of the boaters soon became intolerant of the water that burned their eyes and found themselves squared off against miners and loggers. The public's hasty and oversimplified understanding of the problem characterized the battle as wacky enviros against the evil mining industry. No agency, no organization, no company could begin to solve the problem alone. For years, these abandoned mines continued to leak their poisonous red water, slowly choking the life from the watershed around them.
Acid mine drainage in the Cheat is causing major impacts.
There was almost a fatalistic approach for the previous 20 or 30 years when people simply assumed that since there was acid mine drainage in these rivers that it would always be that way.
Fishermen went upstream, swimmers went to other rivers, and the boating industry felt a huge decline.
This is a powerful river that wants to be alive. It's got a great heritage of being untouched and unhurt, but finally it gets hurt down here.
I can remember definitely the fish that died. Oh, they'd be fish that long in that long river.
You know, fish have rights too. I think this has created a lot of homeless fish.
Many in the watershed felt that something had to be done. Concerned citizen groups tried to raise awareness.
You kind of get sensitive as to preserving it. You know, and when people get in there and step on it a little bit, then you start shouting about it and you start trying to do something about it.
I wrote some letters and to the state trying to see if anything could be done about cleaning up the pollution. And some state agencies had looked at it, but it was a big problem, huge amounts of money estimated to do any kind of reclamation work, so very little was done.
After years of public outcry, the voices finally began to reach Washington.
When Bob Urim became the director of OSM, one of his real interests was to do something positive with acid mine drainage.
I pledged during my confirmation process to be an advocate for increased funding, specifically for the Appalachian Clean Streams Initiative. That's the start, and hopefully the Congress will approve that, and hopefully in each successive budget year, the President and the Congress will continue to appropriate more and more funds from the Abandoned Mine Land Fund so we can clean up abandoned mine lands here in Appalachia and elsewhere in the country.
Working with people like Bob Urim and other folks in the States, in OSM, we were able to put together the Clean Streams Initiative.
The Appalachian Clean Streams Initiative is really a cooperative effort to get government and private industry, citizens, universities, everybody who's interested in cleaning up acid mine drainage involved in that, pooling our talents and resources to this huge problem.
Meanwhile, back in the watershed, a volatile situation was erupting.